what I started noticing right off the bat more than anything else is three primary features where deer trails always ran. So that's another thing to pay attention to when you look at places in the mountains too. It's not only good to find a good topographical feature, but it's also good to find a place where wind is consistent from day to day, from wind change to wind change. And if you look around and try enough places, you will find places that are like that, and those turn out to be real honey holes.
What were the terrain features that you started seeing correlation with a certain terrain feature where you were seeing an increase in deer sign or deer movement or anything like that?
More than anything else, two things. Where I really started noticing, well, I'd say three things more than anything else right off the bat once I started getting out and walking the land. And walking the land then, that's another skill I had to learn too, was how to use a map and a compass, because there was no Onyx, there wasn't any app like that, there was no smartphone. So I pretty much had to learn how to triangulate, and I had to teach myself how to do that. Once again, it's just reading, just a little bit of self-research. If you seek the knowledge, you'll find it if you want it badly enough, and I wanted it badly enough that I found it and I taught myself. And so I went out, the first time I went out in the mountains after I moved out here into the mountains without a compass by myself, I got turned around, And so every time after that, I always carried my map and my compass with me, But what I started noticing right off the bat more than anything else is three primary features where deer trails always ran. And one was at the heads of draws. I was always finding deer trails at the heads of draws, which, if you need an explanation, y'all know what it is, but for anybody out there that doesn't know what it is, a draw is basically a creek or water drainage running off the side of a minor, secondary, or major ridge. It could run off of either one, but it's eroded a crack in the surface of the ground, basically. And so it's a trench or a ditch, Well, the head of that is where it runs into the secondary or the major ridge, where it ends on the ridge. At the bottom, it usually tends to be not much of a funnel. It's usually a little wider down at the bottom than it is at the top, and deer could be crossing it at the bottom, but the problem in the mountains with trying to hunt something like that down low is the swirling wind conditions, So you're better off staying up on high ground, in my opinion. Wind's a lot more predictable, a lot more forgiving. You do have to take thermals into account, but we'll get into that later. The second topo feature, to try and move on quickly, would be saddles, low points and ridges. Some saddles are, not all saddles are equal. Some are better than others, and I find that most of the better saddles usually tend to be better saddles because of bedding being on one side of the saddle and the food being on the other side of the saddle. There has to be a reason that deer want to cross at that low point. Deer are prey animals. They have to have energy in reserve. They never know when they're going to have to use that energy. So they're not lazy, but they're not going to unnecessarily expend energy if they don't have to. So if they see an easy way out, most of the time, especially does, they're going to take it. So if they see a ridge with just a slight little dip in it, like this, just a slight dip, they may or they may not use that. But if it's an accentuated saddle where on one side you've got maybe a decent rise, but the other side you've got a huge rise, that's the ones that I look for. The ones that are a little more extreme. They have a much stronger low point in that saddle. It looks like the saddle on a horse. Looks a lot more like it, Well, that's what a saddle is. It looks like the saddle on a horse. It's a low point between two high points. But the more exaggerated it is, I find the better it is. And like I said, though, you could find one of those and still not find a lot of good deer sign in it. And I think most of the time the reason is because you don't have bedding on one side, don't have food on the other side. And that can vary from season to season. That food moves around from season to season. Sometimes you don't have the same mast one year that you had the next. And so the saddles and how useful they are can sometimes move around from year to year. If you find one that works every year, you're on something really, really good. And it seems like you can also find places in the mountains where you can find a pure wind. You know, it seems like no matter what the wind is doing, except for maybe one direction, you'll find the wind is pretty consistent and it always blows in the same direction or off the same shoulder every time that you hunt in that area, as long as the wind isn't really roaring and out of control. You know, so that's another thing to pay attention to when you look at places in the mountains too. It's not only good to find a good topographical feature, but it's also good to find a place where wind is consistent from day to day, from wind change to wind change. And if you look around and try enough places, you will find places that are like that, and those turn out to be real honey holes. It's, you know, they live or they die by their nose, and you've definitely got the wind to your advantage in a situation like that, okay? Saddles, you know, heads of draws or drainages, okay? Now, the third feature that I was talking about is benches. Okay, benches are like a drainage bonus, because most of the time a bench is a chunk of land that sits off the side pronounced of a ridge. You know, you've got your ridge, it could be a secondary ridge, but most of the time it's the main ridge. Secondary ridges, you know, main ridges are the big ridge, okay? The secondary ridges are the lower ridges that run off the sides of that ridge. If the main ridge is running east and west, hypothetically, then your secondaries for the most part are going to be running north and south off of that ridge. If it's running north and south, the main ridge, then your secondaries would be running east and west, okay? And of course, they can come off at angles, you know, southwest, northeast, etc. You know, sometimes a finger can split and turn into two finger ridges. I call them finger ridges. Some people call them secondary ridges. Some people call them points, but they're all the same thing, you know? Okay, well, a bench is a chunk of land like I've seen sometimes just triangular, flat-shaped things. Sometimes they're long and shaped like a football. Sometimes they're just little round things with a little bit of elevation on them. But basically what they all do is they neck into the ridge. There's a low point of ground where they run into the ridge, you know? And when you have a chunk of land sitting on the ridge like that, in order to create that, you've got erosion on either side of it. So you've got a drainage or a draw on either side of that bench. So when you hunt above a bench, you're basically hunting above the heads of two draws, which is a funnel in itself in the mountains. And so then actually you're hunting two funnels at the same time and doubling your chances of success because it's where two funnels come together. You know, another great thing about benches in our area, I don't know if it's the case in all areas, but here in the Ouachitas, there's usually a lot of food on benches unless they've been reforested, you know, and a lot of this national forest land out here in the Ouachita Mountains, it's okay to say Ouachita Mountains.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where we live. I don't think I'm giving too much away there. It's a pretty large chunk of land. It's millions of acres, you know. Come one, come all. So, but, you know, you've got the bench usually has good food on it. You know, it's a place where does like to come and feed. You know, it's kind of, it's hard for anything below a bench to see what is on that bench. It's hidden, so deer feel secure on benches, you know, and the land is usually got a flat spot behind the bench, so it's easy terrain for a deer to run on too. They don't have to expend a lot of energy. So they like to use these benches to bed on. They like to use them to feed on. They like to use them as a travel route, you know. So those are the three main ones.
The three main ones, I want to stay on the three main ones right now. How would you rank them from your favorite to your least favorite, but still good of the three?
Favorite, if I gave it more of a chance, it could possibly be the drainages, and I'll tell you why I've avoided that mostly over the years in just a moment and explain that to you. But I would say the favorite, I couldn't include drainages because I don't have enough personal experience at them. The two that I do have a lot of experience at is saddles and benches. And if I had to choose one of the two, it would definitely be benches.
Okay. So, okay.
And I think it's mostly because of the fact that you've got, you know, a saddle is basically one funnel. A bench, you're hunting above two funnels. You've got two drainages coming up on either side of that bench. So the potential is better.
Now, when we're talking about the heads of ditches, the benches, and then also the saddles, you're talking about like food's a big factor, bedding's also a big factor. When you're dealing with benches, is it more so food source and travel corridor, less about bedding on a bench?
I think it's less about bedding and more about travel corridor than anything else.
Okay.
But, a lot of these places out here in the Ouachita Mountains, there's a lot of open hardwoods. And as y'all know, when there's a lot of open hardwoods, there's food everywhere. On a good mast year, there's food everywhere. And so that's why I think food is not necessarily the most important part of the equation. It's just, it's been my experience over the years that deer really, really, really like, and especially bucks, like to side hill up drainages in the mountains. And I find a lot of trails running side hills, coming up drainages. And you've got the potential there on both sides of that bench for bucks to come up from either side. And that's not really easy travel. It's not easy for a buck to climb a mountain, but if you'll notice when they do, you very seldomly find a deer trail that just goes straight up and down. It's always at an angle. They're taking the easy way out. They're climbing the terrain slowly over distance. And these drainages kind of do that. They're not down in the bottom of the drainage where they have to fall over a bunch of collapsed timber and large rocks that have rolled down from erosion and things like that. They're side hilling up near the top, but they're staying down just low enough over the top to where they're not silhouetted and can't be seen easily if somebody's looking at the top of that ridge on level with it. They're just staying down below the top just to where they're hidden. But it's an easy way for them to travel, to side hill.